Hello, everyone, and good morning, and welcome to another episode here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. And in today's episode, we have a very special historian interview here today. Now, my guest today is a disabled Egyptologist, lecturer, and disability activist trying the past to the present. Her research is on disability in ancient Egypt, the classical world, and creating inclusive museums. She holds many roles in academic, disability, heritage, and government sectors, and she has cerebral palsy and dyspraxia. Hopefully, I did not butcher that, but I am so excited to have her here on the show to dive deep into her specialization and learn more about her beyond the historian side. So, without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest, historian and disability activist Alexandra Morris. Alexandra, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Gabriel.
Awesome, Alexandra. I am so excited to have you here on the show and to dive deep into your specialization and your journey as an historian.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So, before we begin in the interview, here's a little fun question I'm now asking all of my guests. So, in your career and possibly beyond, is there a little fun fact that possibly not a lot of people know about you?
Okay, that's a really good question. I would say something that might not be immediately obvious unless you're really doing a deep dive on my publications is I am a Trekkie. So I really, really love Star Trek, and I try and name my publications using Star Trek episode titles whenever possible.
Awesome. Awesome. Can you give us a few examples of those?
Yes. I have quite a track record at this point. Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. Tutankhamun Disability is one. Let That Be Your Last Battlefield is from Star Trek, the original series. Disability in Ancient Egyptology, All Our Yesterdays. All Our Yesterdays is again Star Trek original series episode title. And I think the other one is Disability in Ptolemaic Egypt and the Hellenistic World, Plato's Stepchildren. Plato's Stepchildren is again an original series episode title, and I try to tie things thematically by episode to what I'm actually talking about in the publication too. So I'm a little bit yeah. So for example, with Plato's Stepchildren, that was primarily an episode that featured Captain Kirk and the crew of the Enterprise going to go help a civilization that was based on Plato's ideals. They ended up being the civilization very, very ableist and racist and a bunch of other things. But within the course of that episode, there is a disabled character named Alexander, and that entire book is about disabilities. So therefore, there's the tie-in there.
Ah, all right.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
That is actually pretty cool. How in the world did hopefully Paramount did not see like the titles or like strike you for using them in publication?
I don't know, but I've gotten away with it so far, so hopefully we'll see.
That's amazing, Alexander. That is really, really incredible. And I am just very fascinated by your specialty as well. So, meeting a fellow classical historian as well as an Egyptologist is just amazing. So let's dive right into the background of this, like what led you to this. So let's start at the very, very beginning. What really got you interested in Egyptology and creating a specialization based around this?
Okay, I would say I've always wanted to be an Egyptologist, and the specialization in disability didn't come until later. I grew up, I think the thing that started it for me was my parents had got me a set of First Discovery books when I was like maybe 2 years old. And one of those books was on pyramids, and I was just absolutely fascinated with it to the point where I was like, read it again, read it again, read it again. And I had them kept reading it to me. And I was absolutely obsessed within that book with a picture of Howard Carter or illustration discovering Tutankhamun's tomb. And my name
Mm.
for him at the time was Mr. No Talking Man. I have no idea why I called him that, but I was obsessed. And that was, I think, the first book that got me hooked, where I was like, I want to do this. And of course, my parents at the time laughed it off because they're like, there's no way. She's like 2. She knows what she's doing. But it stuck to the point where I was in first grade. I was doing book reports about books that had to do with Egypt, and it just continued from there. The disability specialization didn't occur to me until grad school, which is very weird as a disabled person. But I had gone through school, gotten to the grad school level, and unfortunately, my very first grad program was incredibly ableist. But it just happened that in the university museum that was attached to the program that I was in at the time, they had the mummified remains of a disabled man who had been buried with a cane because he had one leg that was about 6 inches shorter than the other one. So I was looking at him, reflecting on my own personal experiences at the time, and then was like, wait, no one else is researching this. So that set me down that path, and I've become basically one of the people worldwide who studies this, one of the only people. And I'm hoping that I have seen the field expanded since I started, which has been really exciting. But when I started, I was the only one.
Wow. That is amazing, Alexandra. That is simply incredible. And also in this interview, there are going to be some fan questions sprinkled throughout. And here is our first fan question. One of my viewers asked, what was probably the most fascinating piece of research that you've uncovered in your career?
Okay, another really good question. I would say at this point, one of the most exciting things that I've discovered is I have completely reinterpreted the ancient Egyptian god Harpocrates as most likely having or being depicted with cerebral palsy. So they were depicting him as a disabled god in art. For those of you who don't know or are not as familiar with ancient Egyptian history, Harpocrates is a manifestation of the god Horus. Horus is the god of kingship. Harpocrates is the specific manifestation of him, who is a protective deity. So he protects women, he protects children and women in childbirth. And he's also considered the god of secrets and is associated with the sun. And he is depicted in, from what I was able to discover, all of these depictions at various stages of his life. So he's sometimes depicted as an infant, sometimes depicted as a young man, and also sometimes depicted as a woman. So he has a female manifestation as well, known as Harpocrates, as having the signs of someone who has CP. And what was kind of the linchpin for me figuring this out was he's described by the ancient historian Plutarch as, and I'm quoting from Plutarch here directly, being born prematurely with lame legs, end quote, which also matches that symptoms. But it was me using my own symptomology and familiarity and embodiment of cerebral palsy, recognizing this in the art. And no one else before I came along had really recognized this, even though he was described textually in this way. And if you look at the art, it's very, very clear that he's also depicted in this way. We had a lot of other Egyptologists describing him in some of these manifestations as sitting, but if you really look at it, he's not sitting in any of these. He has what's known as a crouch gait, which is something that is commonly associated with CP, where your legs kind of bend at an awkward angle. And what got me about this was the hand positioning. They were describing him as sitting in this, but his hands were not matching up for if he had been sitting, because if they had been sitting, they would have been resting on something, and they were not in that position. They would have been going through whatever chair he was seated on had they been like that. So that's what got me to notice it.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And I think Egyptology is probably one of the most fascinating disciplines in the field of history, which of course branches off into archaeology as well, and many other subdisciplines, which is absolutely, absolutely incredible. So
Mhm.
let's dive right into, so once you graduated with your degrees, and then now beginning your specialty, your discipline within Egyptology,
Mhm.
walk us through it. So you also mentioned earlier that you have published several articles and magazines with, of course, the Star Trek uh, titles and everything, which is, again, really, really cool. When you were working on that, what was sort of like a routine or ritual for you to sort of like get all these informations and research? Are you more of a morning person, night owl when it comes to research? What is sort of like your day-to-day life as an historian, as an Egyptologist?
Okay, another really good question. I would say I'm more of an afternoon slash night owl person. I will find myself like randomly thinking of things in the middle of the night and then going to go look them up and be like, oh, wait, did I think of this? And I will also do a lot of my writing at night as well. I try and well, when I was teaching, because I recently I'm looking for work again, but when I was teaching, um, also I would come home and have to write then because I just couldn't do it during the day because I would be constantly interrupted by students and other inquiries, administrative inquiries during the day. So I basically have like a set writing time or try and write a little bit each day, but it's typically at night. And there are days where I have like days off or something like that, where I may just take like the full day to work on stuff. And that's how I get things done, essentially.
Nice. Very, very cool. Very, very cool. Now, again, going back to your specialty in
Mhm.
Egyptology, the classical world, and disability,
Mhm.
history during the classical age, it
Mhm.
is so fascinating. And obviously, I imagine there was probably moments of finding a lot of scholarship that was probably difficult to find. And I'm very, very curious, when you talk with people about, disability in the classical age, how many times do people bring up Sparta in Greece? I only ask this because when people think of disability in the classical age, the one that is probably the most common, or the one that people can most remember, is Spartans and Sparta culture. And for those who don't know, and this is immortalized in comics as well as the movie 300, Sparta
Mhm.
was very much against any form of deformities in their society. If there was one inkling of an imperfection, they left you to pretty much fend for themselves. And I'm very curious, whenever you talk to people about your specializations, has the name Sparta or Spartans ever been brought up?
The answer to that is yes. The common misconceptions that I get primarily when I start to talk about disability in the ancient world is the Spartan misconception that they did kill disabled babies at birth, or there is the assumption of disabled people just didn't survive. And I do want to emphasize, and it's very interesting that you brought this up as your kind of misconception here, that Sparta did kill disabled infants. We actually, through the work of Debbie Sneed, who does more classical stuff than me, I'm more of a Ptolemaic to just kind of clarify, but I do
Mhm.
classical stuff as well. Ptolemaic Egypt is from the time period that Alexander the Great took over to the death of Cleopatra VII. So it's a roughly
Mhm.
300-year time period. But within Sparta, we actually have evidence, and within Greece as well, that counters this disabled infanticide narrative. The most famous example of that is King Agesilaus II, who ruled in the 400s, who was born with a clubfoot and became king anyway over his nephew, who was deemed at the time to be either a bastard or illegitimate. So, in that case, being a bastard or being illegitimate, it was seen as more disqualifying to becoming king than having a physical disability, which is
Mm.
fascinating. which goes against everything that typically people think of when they think of Sparta. And quoting from the work of Dr. Debbie Sneed, who kind of has pushed back against this idea within ancient Greece as well, we also see evidence in forms of archaeological evidence of feeding bottles that were designed for infants who were having trouble breastfeeding. So they're accounting again for physical disability in that way. And there's the invested care for disabled infants during that time period who would then grow up theoretically to be disabled adults. So that applies against everything that you know of pop culture wise about Sparta and Greece, which is fascinating.
Okay. So if there is this archaeological and historical evidence of these instances, then why does this myth still exist in our culture about Sparta being completely ableist and infanticide society if there is the archaeological evidence that disproves it?
I would like to say I think it's a reflection of our society in general. I think we're a little bit uncomfortable with disability today still, and I think we like to think or tell ourselves that we've made progress in treatment of disabled people, versus like we can look at the ancient past and go, look, at least we're not killing you anymore. At least you're not being treated horribly anymore, when the truth is actually a little bit more complicated than that. And I think it provides kind of a source of comfort for people today to be like, oh, at least we're not doing that anymore. But it's not true. And I just want to emphasize, in terms of the actual historical evidence that we do actually have for the practice, it's all textual evidence, and it's questionable textual evidence at best. We have it being described by Plato and Aristotle when they are talking about their quote unquote idealized societies. But them talking about their idealized societies doesn't mean it was necessarily happening in reality. And we also have our friend Plutarch again, the historian, who describes the practice in relation to his biography of the lawgiver Lycurgus, who was supposed to be really, really strict and like not a nice man. And he's writing about him, though, like over 400 years after Lycurgus supposedly lived. And he tended to do things as more of character sketches rather than straight biographies. So he may have added that in to be more to try and show how strict Lycurgus and unreasonable Lycurgus was being, than actually be a reflection of reality. But that's literally all the textual evidence we have for that practice. So I find it fascinating that that has been passed down as a historical fact when the actual historical evidence we have for it is very shaky. And in terms of other archaeological evidence, and this is kind of an absence of evidence we have for this, some archaeologists did go to where the cliffs where they were supposedly killing these infants and found absolutely no evidence to support this. There's no surviving skeletal remains that they could find.
Fascinating. That's really, really interesting that we pretty much found evidence that disproves the cultural myth about the Spartans, being completely this hardcore warrior society that valued perfection. And, if there was any imperfection, they left you to the wolves. But the truth, the reality is that there is no, as you said, archaeological evidence of human remains at the supposed cliff that these killings were being done at. And even the historical text, while debated in terms of, its authenticity, it does bring up this, it does bring up the contradiction that this wasn't the case. So that's also now interesting to look into the Roman society and for the Roman Republic. And I'm very curious, Alexandra, in your research of the classical age, did anything pop up for the Romans and possibly even for the Egyptians around the time of the Romans?
Okay. thinking through this question, the answer is yes and no.
Mm.
By I mean, I know we have famous examples of disabled individuals from the Roman period, like Claudius, who again had CP. We also had other examples, but there does seem to be, and it's hard to determine how much, kind of a shift during that period, at least in Rome itself, not necessarily in Egypt, toward where things are getting a little bit perhaps more ableist. We do have supposed examples of basically menageries or Roman slave owners deliberately buying disabled individuals to kind of show them off as being like, look, I have these really interesting people, and kind of starting to get kind of that freak show mentality going on. But it's again very hard to interpret or know exactly what's going on during that period, because this is another issue I've run into with my work, and not just in that period, but in other periods. When disabled or scholarship around disability has been completed by more modern day historians, they're quite often bringing kind of these biases into their work that they don't necessarily
Mm.
realize that they're bringing. So things gets interpreted with a kind of a skewed negative bias. So you kind of have to also fight through like what they're saying and kind of fact check them as well, which has been interesting. And one of the projects that I ended up doing with Debbie, again, this was back in 2020 to 2021, was create a terminology guide for how you talk about disability, to try and see if we could get some of these like negative assumptions and biases out of the scholarship.
All
And it was
right.
necessary because people were still using terms like describing disabled individuals as suffering when there was no necessarily evidence that that was what was going on, or still using outright slurs, unfortunately, which makes the scholarship not welcoming if you're a student of this disabled student who's coming in to study this. I don't want to see the R word being used to describe
Mm.
disabled individuals in like 2020. That's unacceptable.
Absolutely. So jumping from that point, so when you're working on either a new publication or a new research, what ultimately is your goal as the premier historian on this specialty? And secondly, what is the promise you're making to not just yourself as the researcher, but also your prospective audience of fellow historians?
Okay, again, really good questions. I would say my primary kind of goals in doing the scholarship is constructing this past, because it's been primarily sidelined or ignored or interpreted with like these kind of negative things that are not necessarily true. So trying to create an actually accurate history with removing some of that bias. And I would say that my other primary goal is using that history, or allowing it to be spread to the general public, to kind of counter this infanticide myth and be like, look, you can therefore then use this history to help with the disability rights movement today, because it creates a historical precedent of actually things were not what we think they were, and things perhaps were more complicated than we think they were. So therefore, this idea of the disability rights movement being this linear progression is not necessarily true. And perhaps we can look at the ancient past for ideas of how actually we can make things better today
Mm.
as
All
well.
right.
And in terms of promises, I think, or that I want for the audience to get out of it, I think all disabled people and non-disabled people have the right to learn about disabled history as a primary history and not as an alternate history, and learn about it in ways that are accessible and free from this negative bias.
Mm. Fascinating. Very, very fascinating. I love doing these shows. I love doing these interviews because I learn so much from all of my guests, from everything. Now, kind of going back a little bit. So, as you mentioned before in the beginning, when you were very, very young and, learning about Egyptology, and as you mentioned before, your parents jokingly said that, oh, she's 2 years old, she's not going to be an Egyptologist, but then here you are in your career as the premier Egyptologist on this specialty. What was the reaction like from friends and family when they learned that not only were you going into the realm of Egyptology, but this was the discipline and focus that you're going to be researching on for your entire life and your entire career?
I guess thinking this through, it was not necessarily a surprise at that point because I had been at this for so long. It was kind of like a reluctant acceptance of like, okay, I guess she's doing this. And they've come around. They've been very, very supportive. I'm sorry, Mom, I was not the psychologist that you wanted me to be. But no, they've been very supportive and very accepting. And it's just been a question of figuring out where to go from here in my career. Because academia, and I'm sure other guests have talked to you about this, is not necessarily the most stable field in terms of jobs.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely. And that kind of, funnily enough, leads into the next set of questions, what I like to call reflective questions. So the first reflective question has to deal with the field of history and its relationship with social media, because the industry has greatly changed within the last 20 years or so. I mean, you could not imagine a lot of historians going on social media and creating content or promoting their work via social media posts. But with the rise of social media, every historian, at least the ones that I follow and have interacted with, are constantly posting their research, constantly making it accessible for others in the field as well as readers to read it, and really growing their platform. Even if they're not social media savvy or driven, it's still another avenue. But like social media and the internet, it's very draining, very, very exhausting, and very, very tiring. Not to mention, social media can be very, very cruel. We do leave ourselves exposed to the negative side of social media, which could, again, drain from us either emotionally or mentally. And sometimes we as historians will be questioned by those on the internet, calling out our backgrounds, our specialties, our expertise, and we'll be forced to defend our academic training. And I'm just curious, Alexandra, in your career, being an historian and Egyptologist in the digital age, like so many others, have you ever had moments of imposter syndrome or heightened anxiety? And if so, or if not, what continues to discipline you to not only be the best Egyptologist, but to stay true to your course and tell in a way, the secret and forgotten history of disability in the classical age?
Okay, I'm thinking through this question. I think I have had moments, yes, definitely of imposter syndrome or just feeling like, really, I'm the person that has to be doing this. I definitely had that with the terminology guide that I ended up putting together with Debbie and co-producing with various members of the disabled community, where it was like, really, I'm the one that has to go tell these other historians like they can't be using this language. Yeah, I've had moments like that, and where it's very terrifying, because it's like, okay, I guess I am the one who has to set the standards for the field, which is not a position that you necessarily want to be in or think you will be in your late 20s, which is when that happened. So yes, I've definitely had it, but I think what's kept me grounded is going like, okay, I can't, is keeping the idea of we deserve the right to history. We deserve the ability to learn about history through these kind of neutral lenses rather than what has been traditionally been published. And that's what keeps me kind of grounded in my work, I want to say, as well as bringing the expertise of I am a disabled person. Therefore, I can use my knowledge and my lived embodiment in ways that perhaps non-disabled historians can't or don't necessarily know about because they're not disabled.
Very true. Very, very true. Now going forward again, this next question talks about a very particular debate of, between academically trained historians and what the internet and social media have referred to as armchair historians.
Mhm.
And the reason I bring this up is that I've been doing this show now for about 6, 7 years. I've had the opportunity to meet so many historians, a lot of them being authors, and I've realized that, during these interviews, that a lot of us began our careers, be that, research, academic writing, content creation, within the last 5 years during the COVID years. And ultimately, it's led to a huge boon in the field of history. And this has started this discussion of, what classifies someone as an historian. And I've seen this debate sort of blossom between the academic community, which is, like you and me and many others, we are academically trained. We've gone to schooling, we've done the research, and those that are deemed as armchair historians, people who are not classically trained, but they are passionate about the history. They do the research, they get their sources, and they create, high quality, informative, and educational content. And this is debated of whether or not, because of these new types of historians existing in the field, are we in a golden age or entering an iron and new age? So, Alexandra, I would like to hear your thoughts on this in two parts. First one, detailing, in your opinion, what classifies as an historian in today's climate. And secondly, if we are in a golden age or a new age.
Okay. Thinking this through, I would say that training is important. I would say that yes, there are things that you can get from training in terms of how not to let biases influence your sources, how not to any of your interpretations of things, but I am also very, very sympathetic to quote unquote alt academics or people who are quote unquote armchair historians. I've published in the Disability in Ancient Egypt and Egyptology book, people who did not necessarily have that training, but their ideas were good because it drew upon, and they were saying necessary things that people were not necessarily saying in the field, but that needed to be said. So I'm very sympathetic with that, and I work collaboratively with those types of people on a lot of projects. One of my other projects that I'm currently doing with again, someone who has no formalized historian training, but the ideas are good, is I'm working with Richard Am as one of the founders of the Disabled Action Research Collective, and his primarily objective is to get historical content into the hands of the general public in the form of zines, which is an accessible format than, let's say, like an actual research article. And that's been his objective, and I've been working with him on that. And what I basically do, as I'm kind of the unofficial VP at this point of the collective, is I will go through and I will fact check to make sure that what we're putting out is actually accurate, and also help him with editing. So I'm very sympathetic to that, and I do think there are ways to go about it, even if you don't necessarily have the formalized training, where you can actually get publishable research and things of that nature. And I don't think necessarily that that's a bad thing. but you just
Very
have to check things to make sure that they are actually factually accurate and they are not leaning in any one direction. In terms of whether or not we're entering a golden age or whether it's a new age, I would say, honestly, I think it's a little bit mixture of both. I think there are very much things that are pointing to this being a golden age. Again, in my opinion, research is getting out there in new formats, new ways that are very exciting, very accessible to look at, and reaching a larger audience. But we're also doing, I think, a new age because we are having to reinterpret how we're doing things and what audiences we're researching, and being very, very careful about how we're putting things out, because things in terms of media can also get wildly misinterpreted very, very quickly too.
Yes, absolutely 100%. And this sort of goes now into what I call the business side of being an historian. So let's start with a little icebreaker question here. So going back before, again, you published a lot of research in the field of Egyptology on history of disability in Egypt, classical age, and so forth. And again, the Star Trek titles, which again are very witty, very, very cool. When you began that part of your journey, what really surprised you about the publication side of being in the field of history as an Egyptologist? And looking back, is there anything you would have done differently in terms of marketing yourself and or showcasing your research?
Okay. I'm thinking through this question again too. I want to say in terms of things that were surprising, I mean, you got this idea when you're coming in from outside of academia that like historians are actually kind of paid for their work. That's not necessarily the case, especially in academic publishing. No, which honestly, yeah, is interesting to deal with. And the other kind of surprising thing, and this is not, again, not to think negatively of any particular company or anything, is I have a better understanding now of how some of this negative content gets into publications in regards to disability. Again, this is not to throw shade at any particular publishers, but in my experience, working as an editor of a book and some other publications, we had a lot of negative things and copy editors who were trying to be helpful by quote unquote correcting terminology that didn't need to be corrected, to the point where it was we had to go back and forth several times to be with them like, look, no, actually just please leave it the way it was. And I think this was in a chapter that we had on deafness. We had the comment back from one of the copy editors that they went through and changed our author's terminology around deafness. And this is a little bit of hyper-specific example. Our author had used lowercase d, capital D to refer to deafness, and that referenced two different deaf communities. Capital D means you were born deaf or you were part of the deaf community. Lowercase d means that you acquired deafness later in life or you are not part of that community. So our author was using those terms, and one of the copy editors went back in and was like, well, no other disability community is referenced in this matter. They've therefore changed everything to just be a lowercase d. And that's like, that's not what our author was trying. So it's dealing with situations like that.
Okay. That's actually really fascinating. I never knew that in the deaf community, there was like two different versions, two different groups for those that were born deaf and those that gradually lost their hearing and became deaf later in life. That is really, really fascinating and really interesting. But then again, these things need to be talked about and showcased. And, you're absolutely right that a lot of people don't know about, the cultures, the history around these communities. I think it is very important to showcase and really highlight that. So now let's talk about the audience for these publications. Now, as historians, we are classically trained again to write in a certain way.
Mhm.
Most of us are trained to write for a very specific niche within the
Mhm.
academic community. But when trying to relay the same information to a more broad audience, that's when you have to take a hard reflection and realize, okay, not everyone's going to get the understanding of the jargon. No one's going to
Mhm.
be as knowledgeable on the source material. We have to write in a way that's easily understandable while
Mhm.
maintaining the authenticity and thoughtfulness of the material. So,
Mhm.
for you, Alexandra, in terms of your publications and your research, have you sort of found your voice, your audience, as the historian that you are? And can you also describe what the challenges has been like of balancing these two, the the authenticity, your voice, your research, but understanding trying to write for an audience that may not be as astute as those in the academic community?
Mhm. Okay, another really excellent question. In terms of my publications, and this is also, I think, what sets me apart from perhaps other historians, I am very conscious of the fact that I have to write for an audience that is not necessarily going to come in with a specialized Egyptological knowledge, but also having to reach across the aisle too. And for publishing in terms of Egyptological stuff, bringing in all the specialized disability studies knowledge and being able to write in such a way that both audiences can pick it up and understand things. So it means, in terms of what I'm doing, a lot of definitions of terms that maybe I wouldn't necessarily always do if I was just writing for an Egyptological audience or a disability studies audience. I'm trying to write in a way where also, if someone who's a member of the general public, like let's say just a random disabled person, picks up this book and is like, I'm interested in this, let me read it, writing in such a way that they can also get something out of it too and understand what I'm trying to say.
All right, all right. Now we get to another very good fan question.
Yeah.
This actually is a really good one. So this viewer asks, is there any other historical time period they would like to take your discipline and explore that history, i.e., let's say, looking at the late antiquities era, but also using your discipline to also discuss disabilities history during the classical age, which could focus on the Franks, the Byzantines, the Sasanians, even, and possibly even go forward in history, like the medieval age.
Okay, in terms of other time periods, what I have been doing more than I had been doing in the past is actually more modern history. And one of the more recent projects that I've just finished, and we're currently waiting on the publisher to get us back our copy edited proofs for that at this point, was do a book that was on disability activism and look at how our modern day disability rights movement, and more specifically disability within the arts, disability arts movement, has been using classical references,
Mm,
so references to the ancient world, and how they're using that to reflect upon their history and how they're understanding them. And then what I came across a lot in that particular research was, again, those references to that infanticide that we now don't think necessarily exists. So that's one project. I think in terms of other time periods, I also, and this is not, I guess I focus on classical world, but I also focus on ancient Egypt before that time period as well. So I go
ooh,
back even further. And I basically try and leave other disability histories up to people who specialize in those various time periods. But I also think it's very, very important for us to dialogue with one another as well, as historians, because what I'm finding in ancient world is not necessarily reflective of what people were finding in other time periods. But if you don't have those conversations with people, then you don't necessarily know that.
mm-mm.
And they need to know that historical context to build upon what they were doing. So one of my others, I'm very busy lady. One of the other groups that I've set up, and this was set up in 2022, is the UK Disability History and Heritage Hub. And we basically have created a space to fill a void of like, okay, let's get various people who are working on disability histories from all time periods the ability to connect and share their research with one another, while also making it accessible again to those lay people who not are necessarily interested in this stuff but don't have that formalized training, in terms of like museum heritage professionals, other disabled people who are interested in this stuff. Because I do think it is very important to have that dialogue with one another, because that influences there for how things are interpreted historically, and then pushing further how things are therefore interpreted in museum contexts as well, and therefore in educational settings.
Absolutely. Again, very, very true, Alexandra. Very, very true. And this kind of goes into another question, which I'm very fascinated to ask you. So, as you mentioned before, as we talked about, the academic side, the academic job of being a historian is very good. But what I definitely feel, and I'm sure you definitely agree with that, when people get into this field, whether it's Egyptology or history in general, we're typically presented with two paths. You can either be a professor, or you can work in some kind of government facility or work in a museum. But not a lot of people are interested in going down those paths. Unfortunately, those seem to be the only ones presented to us, or the ones that have been accepted. And I definitely think as independent historians, a lot of us have tried to create our own careers. I'll give an example. When I was in my final semester of my master's program at San Francisco State, I had the opportunity to attend a workshop, which was about taking our passions in conjunction with history. And one guest who was a speaker was an acclaimed author and historian. He was, if I'm not mistaken, a medievalist, specialized in medieval history, but he was also a talented writer. And that is what he did. And listening to him and hearing him tell that you can make a career as a writer, as an historian, but it's going to be very difficult, that gave me the encouragement to pursue my own path. Has it been easy? No. I've hit some bumps in the road. But I have been able since then to find my voice, craft it, and has since been published in a few independent publications. Shout out to the Historians Magazine, In Command, Hellfighter, The Medievalists, and more recently, Strategy and Tactics and World at War. And tying this all together, I would like to hear your thoughts on how in the field of history and even in Egyptology, there should be these workshops that really help people, help students in particular, realize that there is a third option beyond the standard that we have been told, numerous times over.
Yeah. Again, excellent points here. And I think in terms of myself, I'm still figuring out that kind of third path. I've been having to kind of craft my career as I go along. I worked as in an academic context. I also do a lot of museum consulting, though I'm not doing working professionally in the museum at this point. But it's been trying to navigate that has been really, really interesting. I do very much support workshops and other things to give students those kind of third options, because I do think it's important, because academia being what it is, there are too few jobs and there are too many of us running around. Yes. And that's also what I'm seeing in terms of the museum space as well. There's a lot of people who are trained as historians, who are working as trying to get work as curators and as museum educators and other parts of that field. But again, there are not necessarily enough jobs going around. So I do think it's a real problem, and I think it does need to be addressed. And I'm still kind of trying to forge my own path at this point, where I have irons going in various fields, but I've yet to find a permanent career path. So I'm still very much juggling around between temporary contracts between places at this point.
Very true. Very, very true. The struggle of being an historian, viewers and listeners, is real. This is not a get-rich-quick
No.
career
Or
like
at all.
other disciplines. Yes. Like other disciplines, it is very, very grinding work. It is, of course, very fulfilling work if you are truly passionate about this industry.
Yes.
And like our guest, Alexandra, she is passionate about her discipline, her field, and no matter what, come hell or high water, she is going to pursue it and share it. Just as same for myself, other historians that have been on the show, and those around the world. And we now reach the final two questions of this amazing and quite informative historian's interview. And here they are, Alexandra. With everything you've learned in your career thus far, and will continue to learn down the road, what do you want people to take away from not only your personal research, but the research you've gathered with other historians and co-authored? And secondly, what is your word of wisdom to future historians wanting to get into this industry?
Okay, I'll start with the first question. I think in terms of takeaways that I want people to get out of my research and the work that I've worked on with others, disabled people have always existed. We have always been part of society to varying degrees. And that disability history is a lot more complicated and nuanced than what we have traditionally been taught, if it has been taught at all. I would say are my main takeaways from that. And we do have a right to learn about that history too. In terms of any advice or words of wisdom to give to people who are trying to get into this field, I think I echo very much what you just said. This is very definitely a passion, and you have to be very committed to being able to do this. If you want to go off and make money, then this is perhaps not the field for you at all. Or if you want a stable career, this is not necessarily the field for you. But if you are willing to put in the time and effort and be okay with being financially insecure and figuring out and having to be creative with ways to make things work, then you absolutely can do this. And it's a question of being willing to stick to the path and being able to stick to what you know you're doing is worthwhile, I would say.
Yes. Beautifully said, Alexandra. Beautifully said. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude this amazing historian's interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I want to give a huge thank you to Alexandra Morris for coming on the show, and we wish her the very best in her career and for the rest of 2025 and going into 2026. Now, Alexandra, where can people find you on social media if they want to follow you and stay up to date, as well as view and possibly purchase your publications that you have worked on, as well as co-authored with others?
Okay, I would say in terms of social media handles, I gave you my LinkedIn link, which is, I think, too long to say on there, but LinkedIn is definitely a place to find me. I'm also on Blue Sky as Disabled Archaeo, which is short for Disabled Archaeology. And I am on Instagram as AFM1290. And the various projects that or groups that I'm associated with, which you can also contact me at or also follow, are the UK Disability History and Heritage Hub, which is on Twitter and Blue Sky under that handle. The Museum Education Roundtable, which publishes the Journal for Museum Education, which is a peer-reviewed journal. We're on Blue Sky and Twitter and LinkedIn under that handle, Museum Education Roundtable. I'm also one of the co-founders of Crip Antiquity, which is a group that is dedicated to advocating and supporting disabled people in ancient world studies and ancient history. We're on Blue Sky, Twitter, and Facebook under Crypt Antiquity. And I'm also trying to think through. I'm involved in a lot of things. As I said, I'm a member of DARC, the Disabled Action Research Collective. We're on LinkedIn under Richard Am, Instagram, and Blue Sky at this point, and we're under Disabled Action Research Collective and Facebook, and Richard Am is his name because he's the founder of the group. And we also do have a website or linked on there, a link tree, which I can provide you and you can give to your viewers, where you can download every zine we've made so far for free as well. And if you want my publications, feel free to get in touch with me at any of the above places. And I'm also happy to send them to people if they want to read them and they don't have access.
Awesome. Thank you, Alexandra. I'll provide all those links down below in the description of this video. And if you'd like to see Alexandra again in a Historians Lounge episode, again, comment down below, like, and subscribe. And as always, viewers and listeners, thank you again for joining us for an amazing episode here on the channel. A huge thank you to Alexandra Morris for coming on the show. And hopefully this will not be the last time we have her on the show. Very much enjoyed the discussion, and there's a lot more that needs to be discussed and explored. So, again, if you would like to see her back on the show for another interview or for a special episode, comment down below. And until next time, viewers and listeners, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Wish you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. Have a wonderful morning, everybody, and we'll see you next time.